Hello, welcome once again to Lehto's Law. I'm Steve Lehto. Today we're talking about double jeopardy. The Supreme Court ruled on this yesterday. I did a video last week about the bad movie called Double Jeopardy, and I had several people ask me, why didn't you do a video about double jeopardy itself? And I was thinking about it, and then the Supreme Court ruled on it, so here we are. Several people sent me the opinion, including Jack. Thank you very much. I think Jack was first, but probably a dozen people sent it to me. Keep them coming. You never know, I might miss something. But first, let me give you the facts of the case. In November of 2015, a local police officer in Mobile, Alabama, pulled Gamble over for a damaged headlight. Smelling marijuana, the officer searched Gamble's car where he found a loaded 9mm handgun. Gamble had previously been convicted of a second-degree robbery. His possession of the handgun therefore violated an Alabama law providing that no one convicted of a crime of violence shall own a firearm or have one in his or her possession. After Gamble pleaded guilty to the state offense, federal prosecutors indicted him for the same instance of possession under a federal law. That federal law forbids those convicted of a crime punishable by imprisonment for a term exceeding 1 year to ship or transport in interstate or foreign commerce or possess in or affecting commerce any firearm or ammunition. That's 18 U.S.C. 922 sub G sub 1. Now, you might ask me and say, Steve, was Gamble really doing something in interstate commerce with that gun? You never know. That's not the point here, because that was not brought up on appeal. So we move on. Gamble moved to dismiss on one ground only, that the federal indictment was for the same offense as the one at issue in his state conviction, and thus exposed him to double jeopardy. But because the Supreme Court, has long held that two offenses are not the same offense, for double jeopardy purposes, if prosecuted by different sovereigns, the district court denied Gamble's motion to dismiss. Gamble then pleaded guilty to the federal offense while preserving his right to challenge the denial of his motion to dismiss on double jeopardy grounds. On appeal, the 11th Circuit ruled against him, citing the dual sovereignty doctrine, and the Supreme Court granted certiorari to determine whether to overturn the doctrine. And so here's the thing. The man was carrying, allegedly, in his possession, a loaded handgun, which he was not allowed to have by state law. He was not allowed to have it by federal law. So he got arrested for that one incident where he was in possession of a loaded handgun. And it looks to most people like, yeah, that's one thing you did. So how do you get prosecuted by two different entities saying it's two different crimes? Isn't that what double jeopardy is all about? The Supreme Court says no, and this was a 7-2 ruling. This wasn't a close call as far as the Supreme Court goes. So I got a story here out of Bloomberg, but there's several different places. I've actually read a lot of stories on this yesterday and today. But the justices voted 7-2 to leave intact what they call the separate sovereigns doctrine. This thing goes way back, and it limits the scope of the ban on double jeopardy. Elimination of the separate sovereigns rule would have meant, for instance, that a presidential pardon might block some state charges as well, should anybody ever, be charged under a federal statute and be friends with the president. So the case that we're talking about right now, though, the SCOTUS case, is Terrence Gamble's case. And he said his constitutional rights were violated when charged both under Alabama and federal law. And so here's the thing. The Constitution's Fifth Amendment says that no one shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Seems pretty simple. And so there was this doctrine called the separate sovereigns doctrine that the Supreme Court described a while back, and they are often said that this is an exception to the double jeopardy rule. Well, Monday, Justice Samuel Alito wrote in the opinion that the separate sovereigns rule is not an exception. It's the rule. And he said, it follows from the text that defines that right in the first place. Says simply, read what the statute says. An offense is defined by a law, and each law is defined by a sovereign. So where there are two sovereigns, there are two laws and two offenses. In other words, you've got two different sovereigns over you wherever you are in the U.S. The feds and whatever state you're in, okay? And these overlap, obviously. So here in Michigan, I'm under Michigan law and federal law. You in Alabama are under Alabama law and federal law. So he's basically saying that each of those sovereigns has the right to pass their own laws and to enforce their own laws. And by definition, a violation of this law passed by the feds and a violation of the state law passed by the state are separate offenses as far as the Constitution goes. I know that a lot of people don't agree with that, but again, this is what the Supreme Court has ruled. An unusual pairing of justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Neil Gorsuch, dissented. Meanwhile, Justice Clarence Thomas, who just 3 years ago said that he thought the Supreme Court should revisit this issue and probably overturn it, said in a concurring opinion that he had changed his mind. And this is the quote: I agree that the historical record does not bear out my initial skepticism of the dual sovereignty doctrine. So he ruled on the side of the seven, but wrote his own opinion. In recent decades, federal prosecutors have invoked the separate sovereigns doctrine to press civil rights charges against people who've already faced state criminal charges. In 1993, for instance, a federal jury found two Los Angeles police officers guilty in the beating of Rodney King, even though they'd already been acquitted of state charges. That's probably the most famous one. There have been others, though. But again, with Rodney King, everyone saw the videotape of what happened at the side of the road. So state charges were brought against the people who appeared to be hitting Rodney King, and a state jury came back and found those people not guilty of the charges. So the feds stepped in and charged the same people, the same defendants, but said, some of the same defendants, and said, well, we're going to try them for violating the civil rights of Rodney King. And they got a conviction there. And a lot of people are bothered by that because they say, but doesn't it all arise from the same transaction, for lack of a better word? Same fact pattern, the same players, the same actions, same crime? Well, the Supreme Court is saying that's not the case, though. These are different crimes alleged by different entities, and each of those entities, those sovereigns, have the right to pass laws and enforce them. The fact that some of the laws appear to be similar, such as the one in Alabama where it's, oh, you're a felon with a gun, it's against the law. Oh, in the feds, you're a felon with a gun, against the law. You know, most people think that's what the double jeopardy clause is about, isn't it? Well, Supreme Court disagrees with you. There have been other cases. Another example I can give you is Vincent Chin was the victim of vicious crime in Michigan in 1982, and he was an American of Chinese descent who was beaten to death by some men with a baseball bat in front of witnesses. And when those men were arrested, they managed to get the charges against them reduced to manslaughter, and they didn't spend any time in jail for committing manslaughter, despite the fact they'd beaten a man to death with a baseball bat in front of witnesses. And so there was an uproar, as you might imagine, in the community. And there were overtones of this that involved racism because there were witnesses who said that the men beating Vincent Chin to death had blamed him for the downfall of the American auto industry because they mistakenly thought he was Japanese, when in fact he was of Chinese descent. So the feds then stepped in and tried these guys for violation of Vincent Chin's civil rights. And I believe they got a conviction, although that was tied up on appeals for years. But the point is there's a second set of trials, or second trial, based on the federal statutes versus the state statutes. And that was in 1982. That's long before I went to law school, but I remember following those stories in the paper. And actually, at the time, going, this seems odd to me, because these guys were put on trial in the state court system, and they had a resolution there. This isn't double jeopardy? You know, so I think this knee-jerk response is very natural. But again, the Supreme Court is saying, well, you have different crimes passed by different entities, and each of them has the right to prosecute. And if you think about it from the other side, there's some things that would make sense here, because if somebody couldn't be prosecuted for the other ones after being prosecuted for these, you could have some situations where a lousy prosecution being done by one or the other, or something game playing by one side or the other, might result in some kind of injustice, but a lot of speculation on that one. Or you could wind up with a bad movie like Double Jeopardy with Ashley Judd. But the other thing that parallels this that people often ask me about is how it is that someone can be acquitted of a crime and then still sued successfully as if they'd committed the crime. And the most famous example of that, of course, is O.J. Simpson. who was famously found not guilty by a jury for the 2 murders of which he was accused. And shortly thereafter, the families of the victims, at least one of the families, pushed very, very hard in a civil case against Mr. Simpson and won a verdict against him that ran into millions of dollars. And I've had people ask me about that. They say, wait a second, the guy's found not guilty by a jury, so the jury says he didn't do it, then how can a civil jury say he is liable for damages as if he did do it? And there's a couple different things going on there, not the least of which is the criminal jury didn't say he didn't do it. The criminal jury said that they found him not guilty. And the finding not guilty simply means he was not found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the crimes of which he was accused. And a civil case has to do with liability and whether you are more likely than not to have been liable for damages. And a jury said, well, we find that he is liable for these damages. And although these are 2 separate juries, 2 separate instances, it's very, very conceivable that those 2 things can make sense in the same universe. Because to find you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt that you've committed murder takes a very, very high standard. But to simply find you liable for damages for something you may have done is a lower standard. And so you can see how, well, there's not this much proof, but there is this much proof, for instance, to give you an example. So that's how that works. But I think the biggest problem people have with double jeopardy is not so much with the Vincent Chin case or necessarily the Rodney King case, but with the case like Gamble's case, where it appears that it's like they're piling on. They're simply saying, okay, this guy did this, it's a violation of state law, and it's identical to federal law, but we're gonna prosecute him for that as well. And the real question is, what are the purposes of those laws? What are those laws trying to accomplish? And because of the insertion of the stuff about interstate commerce in the federal statute, the argument is that there's somehow something about interstate commerce or gun trafficking or something that there's a federal interest in that's different than the state interest of keeping guns out of the hands of convicted felons. I suppose that's it, okay? But I still think that most people like the idea of double jeopardy protection. That is, you get charged with a crime, you're found not guilty, the state can't step back and go, you know something, we want to try that again because we don't like the way it came out. And they try you a second time. We don't like the way it turned out. And they just keep trying you till they get a guilty verdict, okay? Everyone understands, you know something, take your best shot, let's see how that goes. And if I'm found not guilty, I get to walk out of here. And the idea that you can walk out of here and immediately be rearrested and tried for the federal parallel to the crimes that you were charged of, I think strikes a lot of people the wrong way. But as of right now, Supreme Court says, perfectly fine, dual sovereigns, they both have overlapping jurisdiction, and they can both charge you. And that's the way things are. And again, people will say, Steve, but what do you think about this law? I'm not too crazy about this ruling. And the problem I have with it is I think they actually should look at whether or not the crimes being charged are the same for practical purposes. With the civil rights violations and being beaten to death, those to me are fairly different. But possession of a handgun as a felon, seems a lot alike to me. But it's not up to me, it's up to the Supreme Court. And people also ask me about these things. I say, look, as an attorney, it's my job to tell you what the law is, okay? This is the law, Supreme Court, highest law of the land. That's the way the law is. You want to change that, you could amend the Constitution. There's a process for doing that. Or we could wait till the Supreme Court makeup changes. And there's a way of watching that happen. That's just generally, the application of a lot of time. Wait and see what happens. So that's the situation right now. Gamble versus the U.S. Double jeopardy. It's not double jeopardy. It's the dual sovereigns doctrine. Questions or comments? Put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later.